If there is one theme that has been pretty consistent when it comes to prisons, it's that the global prison system is in need of an overhaul. Prisons are generally expected to be places where people go to be rehabilitated, learn from their past mistakes, and be molded into model citizens ready to be reintroduced into society. But for some prisons, life in there can truly be unbearable. In the heart of Russia, there is one such prison that has garnered a reputation so notorious that it is said that inmates aren't even able to escape if they die. It is a prison where many of Russia's worst and most hardened criminals are sent to rot, and one which has gotten a lot of attention on it for a while now. Join us in this extraordinary journey as we look into what it feels like to be locked inside Russia's deadliest prison. Volgodsky Piatak, Russia's Alcatraz. If you've been paying attention to the world of crime and criminal justice, then you have probably heard about Volgodsky Piatak. This is a prison that has become especially notorious for its harshness and the brutal conditions that its inmates are subjected to. And if you think some of the stories that have been heard are exaggerated, well, let me tell you, things are just as bad as you've been told. To really understand just how eerie this prison is, we probably need to start with its location. You see, about 460 kilometers north of Moscow in the Vologda province, we have a small lake that rests on a sprawling woodland region. The lake, called Novozero, has a small island smack in its middle. Ogneny Ostrov, or Fire Island, as its name loosely translates, is almost completely detached from Russia's mainland, with the two only being connected by a narrow bridge. And right in the heart of Fire Island, we have Volgodsky Piatak. Officially, this prison is known as Prison OE-256-5, but most of its inmates just call it Piatak, which means /5. If you thought this prison's location was eerie enough, then you should consider its history as well. According to official sources, Fire Island actually played home to a Russian Orthodox monastery back in 1517. The monastery was built by Saint Cyril of Novozero, who claimed that he witnessed a column of fire hitting the island. So that was kind of how the island got its name. Anyways, the monastery stood firm on the island until the famous October Revolution in 1917, when Russia's Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, engaged in a coup that led to the overthrowing of the monarchy at the time. The Bolsheviks were mostly atheists, so they drove out all the monks who had been living in the monastery and took hold of the property for themselves. Following the revolution, the monastery was converted into a gulag, mostly used to hold those whom the Bolshevik Party had deemed to be enemies of the revolution. Fast forward to the 30s and the 40s, and the prison mostly worked as a penal colony that held victims of Joseph Stalin's infamous purges. Then, after Stalin passed away in 1953, the prison was transformed into a normal penitentiary for Russia's most dangerous non-political criminals. The transformation didn't stop there, though. In 1997, Volgodsky Piatak was converted into a facility that exclusively held prisoners serving life sentences, as well as those who had formerly been sentenced to death, but whose sentences were commuted to life following a moratorium on the death penalty in Russia. Since then, Volgodsky Piatak has remained arguably the most infamous prison in all of Russia. It's known by many as Russia's Alcatraz, and up until the mid-2010s, the prison was said to hold about 190 to 200 convicts, many of whom rank among Russia's most violent and dangerous. A fortified fortress. Befitting its nature as a high-security prison, even the building of Volgodsky Piatak is insane. To date, it's never been breached, and no one has managed to escape through.
Our walls are between 80 and 150 centimeters thick. You can't dig a hole through them overnight without being noticed.
Even if someone managed to dig through the walls and come out on the other side, it's not exactly like they'd see anything of value. As I said, The entirety of Fire Island is surrounded by a massive lake, and the only way to get through to the mainland is to go through the connecting bridge, a bridge that's heavily guarded.
The island is surrounded by water and swampland.
If an inmate of this island somehow managed to climb both sets of walls and evade the guards and their dogs, they would still have to swim through incredibly icy waters just to escape. The lake on which this island stands measures a staggering 12 square kilometers, so that's definitely not a small swim to make. The alternative would be to run the length of the wooden bridge that connects the island to the mainland, but as I said earlier, that would pretty much be a death sentence. Still, if the prisoner miraculously managed to make it to shore, he would now have to walk for several kilometers, bracing the harsh weather and unforgiving environment. And even after that, it would be pretty difficult to maintain their identity and prevent the small-town folk from spotting them. Merely looking at the outside of the prison, you get a sense that it's almost a wasteland. And that is exactly what it is. In the summer, temperatures in this prison can hit 35 degrees Celsius. But when the winter months come, temperatures easily drop to 30 degrees. So, you can really just get a glimpse of how insane the living conditions here would get when it's winter. That alone is enough to make several of the inmates wish that they were literally sentenced to death instead of being forced to stay here.
At the moment, I'd prefer the firing squad. What have I got to live for anyway?
Besides the strong walls and structures, the prison guards also conduct multiple rounds of checks and inspections across the prison's externalities. These checks happen several times a day, with the guards being armed with dogs and checking every nook and cranny to ensure nothing goes wrong. Considering the caliber of prisoners that reside here, the prison authorities take great pains to make sure that Volогодский Piatak is airtight and free of any materials or opportunities for the prisoners to get armed. This means that they conduct routine searches of prisoners' cells while also paying great attention to the build of the prison and ensuring that nothing is out of place.
All secured. The beds are welded to the floor. Cells like these always accommodate 3 or 4 inmates. The only place with any privacy is the toilet. That's bolted to the floor, too. The lights, plumbing system, it all works. The ventilator gets rid of the smoke very quickly. We can also see everything the men do in their cells through the security cameras. And we can maintain contact with the prisoners through an intercom system without any risk to ourselves.
It is almost as if the guards themselves are scared of having to come physically close to the prisoners. And to be fair, you can kind of see why. When it's your job to literally handle the most dangerous criminals in a country like Russia, I think it's safe to say that you'd want to keep your distance as much as you possibly can. To ensure they can better manage the inmates, the guards work with psychologists to create psychological profiles for each one of them. During these sessions, the inmates come in, speak about the crimes they committed, and also share insights about their mindsets and whether they feel remorse for what they did. Everyone, from serial sex offenders to murderers and everything in between, will have to be subjected to these evaluations. And they form an integral part of the entire justice process in this prison. Most of the prisoners at Volогодский Piatak are sent there on life imprisonment sentences. And in Russia, this sentence isn't one that's trifled with. When you're sent to prison for life, you literally never step out of its walls until the day you die. The only hope that some people have is that they could be given an opportunity to appeal after 25 years, but even that is an outcome with a slim to none chance of being approved. Still, it's the hope that keeps a lot of these guys going. The ruthless isolation. Now, given the type of criminals that are in this prison, you would think that violence would be the order of the day. These are the most ruthless and dangerous people in Russia, so tussles should happen. Well, the truth is that violence can be a risk, but it's not the biggest danger or factor that makes life in this prison so unbearable. Instead, the weapon of choice for the prison guards is the immense feeling of isolation that every prisoner gets. The moment a prisoner gets into Volогодский Piatak, they are quickly processed and placed in a cell with a fellow inmate. There are little to no distractions allowed, and during the day, the beds in the prison cells are stowed away, meaning that inmates are forced to either stand or sit. This is literally what every single day looks like in this prison. Inmates are kept in their cells for 22 hours of the day, and every single day has pretty much the same routine. For inmates who prove to be stubborn or who constitute a menace, the punishment is even worse: isolation. These prisoners are sent to small, dark rooms with little ventilation, and they're kept there for at least 15 days straight. The only company such a prisoner will have is the small metal bucket placed in the dark cell with him. The isolation even gets worse. According to reports, an inmate at Volогодский Piatak is only allowed to have 2 visits per year for the first 10 years they're in the prison. Each visit is only allowed to last a maximum of 2 hours, so they have to wrap things up pretty quickly. After the first 10 years, the inmates are allowed to have 2 additional visits per year, but this also means that individual visits have to be shorter than the initial 2 hours allotted. When you consider the size of Russia and the difficulty involved in even getting to Fire Island, you'll find most inmates' families could end up traveling for days just to spend less than 2 hours with them. The inmates can get parcels from their family and friends, but those are limited to 2 per year as well and are heavily screened to make sure that there is no contraband. So, you see, no matter how you slice it, this prison finds a sneaky way of taking something from inmates and keeping them as isolated from the outside world as possible. It should come as no surprise that by the time those 10 years have even passed, many of these prisoners would have lost all contact with their family members and friends. The only companions they will have effectively will be themselves. That said, there are a few inmates who get a chance to work for a living at the very least. Fire Island Prison has a sewing shop where clothes are made for inmates and guards, as well as sold off to local communities around the island. Inmates who believe they could have a shot at parole after their first 25 years can volunteer to work here, earning a little money, which they hope to be able to spend on the off chance that they get out someday. But the slots here are very limited. Fewer than 50 people end up getting these jobs, and they pretty much have to work every day for years in the slim hopes that they end up making it out. Add this to the fact that the chances of being paroled, like I said, are incredibly slim, and you'll find that even the opportunity to work doesn't seem like salvation at all. Sure, an inmate might get the opportunity to volunteer, but the odds are so stacked against them that it almost seems like there's no point from the get-go. All of this is without considering the fact that sanitary conditions at Volогодский Piatak are quite terrible. The lavatories and washing facilities are pretty run down, and it sure doesn't look like there's any hope for a renovation. So, besides the fact that an inmate essentially is on his own, he now has to worry about diseases like cholera and tuberculosis. Plus, it's not like there are ample opportunities to even be active and give the mind and body proper exercise. I mean, even in a country as harsh as Russia, you have prisons where special time is allotted every day for exercise. At Volогодский Piatak, though, this is basically done as a joke. According to reports, inmates at Volогодский Piatak are allowed to walk in the open for an hour and a half every day. But this isn't necessarily a walk. Instead, the inmates basically traipse around in cages that measure 2 meters by 2 meters in size. There's little room to even walk around, zero physical training equipment, and the walks are supervised by guards who literally stand over the inmates in the cages. It's almost as if these walks, if we can even call them that, are designed to mock the inmates. I mean, how much physical exercise or mental stimulation can you get from walking in a cage while an armed guard looks down on you all through? All in all, the conditions at this prison have been deemed extremely hard and life-threatening. And to be honest, It's almost a miracle that this prison doesn't record more deaths than it does. Speaking of death, this is usually seen by many as the third and final way out of Volогодский Piatak. But for some inmates, that might not necessarily be the case. You see, when an inmate passes away here, his body will need to be claimed by his relatives. If they don't bother to claim him, then the prison guards take his body to a small village graveyard close to the island. The body is eventually buried with zero ceremony under a marker that bears a serial number, not even the guy's name. To make things worse, even other prisoners aren't allowed to attend the funerals of their fellow inmates. The entire thing is done in the presence of maybe 1 or 2 guards. And that's it. Profiles of notable inmates. With such soul-crushing loneliness and destitution, it's not uncommon to find several inmates turning to religion as some sort of safe haven. But while there have been a few cases of prisoners really turning a new leaf, most of the guards don't necessarily believe this. In an interview with the Houston Chronicle from back in 2005, the prison warden at the time claimed that most prisoners really just use religion as a means of possibly getting aid and resources from international religious groups. To him, all of this is a ruse that should be paid no mind whatsoever. One such prisoner who claims to have found God is Mikhail Brukharov. Back in the mid-90s, Mikhail gained widespread notoriety after he was found guilty of murdering his friend. According to reports, he had committed a murder, and his friend found out about it. Scared that this friend would rat him out to the authorities, Mikhail took a knife and stabbed the guy multiple times, essentially dismembering him.
Can you see who's holding this being in his hand? The devil. Yes, the devil or evil. What's this tattoo got to do with God? Nothing. I did it before I'd found God. And when did you find your faith? 3 years after the tattoo on my back. Is that prisoner you? Yes, above me is God, who forgives our sins. And you really are religious today? Yes. So you found your way to God in prison? Yes, after the sentence of death by firing squad. When was that? 1994. Why wasn't the sentence carried out? Because there was a moratorium on death penalties. When? I think it was 1994. So the death penalty converted you? Yes.
Mikhail explained that he essentially found religion because he believed that God spared his life and saved him from the death penalty. Still, with so many years now in Volогодский Piatak, he couldn't escape that feeling of emptiness and loneliness that had taken over.
At the moment, I would prefer to be shot. What am I supposed to do here? What have I got to live for? There's always the chance of parole after 25 years. What chance? It's all just theory. Some have been here for 30 years. Nobody gets out alive.
Mikhail had lost faith in the chance of parole, even claiming that no one gets to leave the prison alive. And as far as he was concerned, the only way he could leave Fire Island would be in a coffin. So they might as well get on with it now instead of making him suffer there any longer. Another notable prisoner is Vyacheslav Sharoyevsky. In the final days of the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav had risen to prominence as a major legal practitioner. At a very young age, he had risen to become a major prosecutor in the Smolensk region, and his fame even saw him work on busting a massive corruption ring in Uzbekistan. Sadly, all of this went downhill in 1989. Vyacheslav was said to have been facing a bit of a depression, and he went on a massive bender that saw him kill 2 women brutally. For his crimes, Vyacheslav was sentenced to death. But on the day his number was to be punched, a prison official stormed the execution cell and told him that he wouldn't be dying that day. That was the day when then-Russian President Boris Yeltsin signed the moratorium banning all executions across Russia. Vyacheslav was overcome with emotion. He told a journalist that Jesus Christ himself had come to save him, and he added that ever since that day, he had been an avid believer in God, thanking him for the gift of life. Of all the inmates at this prison, however, perhaps the most notorious is Nur Pashi Kulayev. Born in October 1980, Kulayev was the only survivor of a Chechen military organization that attacked a school in Beslan, North Ossetia, in September 2004. With about 30 other terrorists, Kulayev stormed this school, taking over 1,000 hostages, including students, teachers, and even parents. The hostages were moved into the school gym, which was rigged with dangerous explosives. And for 2 days, the terrorists negotiated with local and national authorities. But after security forces heard what appeared to have been explosions inside the school, they rushed in, launching a full frontal assault on the insurgents. When the dust settled, this was one of the darkest days in Russia's history. A total of 333 hostages, many of which were children, lost their lives in the bloodbath. At the same time, all of the terrorists were killed, all except Kulayev. He survived, and while a local mob almost lynched him, he was eventually taken into custody. Kulayev continued to deny killing anyone himself. Still, the fact that he was even among the terrorists meant that his fate was sealed. In July 2006, he was sentenced to life in Volогодsky Piatak for terrorist acts. Rumors surfaced about a year later that Kulayev had died in prison, which probably wasn't a shock since Volогодsky Piatak is a harsh place, and he most likely wouldn't have had any friends even amongst Russia's worst criminals. However, in 2014, he once again surfaced in a documentary developed by Russia Today. In the documentary, Kulayev didn't necessarily seem remorseful about what he had done. He read letters from the parents of a victim of that terrible incident, but that barely moved him. He just shrugged it off and dismissed the whole thing. That said, a senior psychologist at the detention facility actually attested to the fact that Kulayev's mental state had indeed deteriorated ever since he had been in Volогодsky Piatak. As she claimed, he said that he had several nightmares and could even see blood coming from the walls. Kulayev's deteriorating mental state was a perfect example of just how terrible the living conditions were at Volогодsky Piatak. The psychologist who examined him claimed that most inmates tend to see their personalities change after about 3 years, adding that there is no way anyone could spend 25 years there and not be changed psychologically. These are prisoners who literally lose their access to the outside world, as well as their families. At the same time, they're not necessarily given the chance to exercise or even stimulate their minds. The little employment opportunity in the prison isn't even distributed evenly, and there's little reason to engage in it when the inmates know they probably won't be leaving the prison unless they're in a body bag. All of these just make it easy for people to break down. And when you think about it, even though violence isn't necessarily a frequent threat, there's enough here to make an inmate completely lose their mind. Outro. Prisons can be insane, but in the land of prisons, Volогодsky Piatak absolutely stands out for its harshness. You might want to think that the criminals here deserve what they're getting, but the level of detachment and solitude that's seen here is truly enough to break anyone. What do you think, though? Do you think a prison like this would even be allowed in the United States? Let us know in the comments.